What do you class consciousness as?
You know, after all the research and, over, a couple of 100 years, I mean, the nature of consciousness still remains elusive. There's not one person, scientist, medical doctor, researcher that can define it. We still, now most people in the mainstream will tell you that consciousness is absolutely generated by the brain and electrochemical processes take place and synapses, fire, and that's what produces the experience that we have. Although it doesn't explain the subjective experiences, that we have. I mean, how did these electrical chemical processes result in emotions like love?
Welcome to the Prime Life Project podcast, a place to help you unlock your full potential, both mentally and physically, to become the best version of you. Welcome back to another episode of the Prime Life Project podcast. I'm your host, Daniel James, and if you're new to the podcast, welcome. Again, if you're a regular listener, welcome back. Again, if you take any value from today's episode, please don't forget to like and share it with a friend. And again, if you could leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcast and now on Spotify, actually, there's a little 5-star rating thing. That'd be absolutely incredible to help us spread the word, to help as many people as possible. Now, today's episode, I've got one thing that I'd like to ask from you guys. Now, don't ever ask anything from you, but on today's episode, I want you to approach it with an open mind. Like, I've got a fantastic guest today, but as soon as we start talking, please have an open mind and just hear the guy talk, because again, it's something that I think can help some people. Now, some people are going to completely poo-poo it, which is absolutely fine. But for some people, I think it genuinely could really help them if they are open to it. So my guest today is Bob Ginsberg, and he started researching the evidence of the survival of consciousness soon after his daughter's death in 2002. He was devastated by the loss, and he needed science to tell him if she still existed in some form. In 2004, Bob and his late wife, Phran, founded Forever Family Foundation, a global not-for-profit that educates the public around evidence that we are more than our physical bodies. Bob hosts the Signs of Life radio show and has been past editor of Signs of Life magazine. He heads the foundation of Medium Evaluation Certification Program and writes blogs at beyondthefivesenses.com. Also, Bob, Phran, and Forever Family Foundation are currently featured on the Netflix documentary series Surviving Death. So again, I've been binge watching that to do my research into Bob. So again, I strongly recommend you go and check that out after the podcast as well. So again, without further ado, welcome to the podcast, Bob.
Thank you, Daniel. It's my pleasure to be with you today.
Obviously, the topics that we're going to talk about today is going to be a topic that most people are very, very skeptical about. Now, I've done some extensive research into you, and I'm really looking forward to go down this rabbit hole, because the sort of the position that you take is from the position of looking out for the people that actually go and see mediums, which I think is absolutely brilliant. Like, you almost like try and make sure that they're protected and not taken advantage of while they're potentially going through a very traumatic, potentially emotion-driven time. So before we get into your work, can you just take me back to where this journey all started for you? Because I know that you started out as a skeptic. So can you take my audience back to skeptic Bob, and then how you transitioned into the position that you are now?
Yeah, going back prior to 2002, when I reflect back, I was a skeptic, as you said, but I was an open-minded skeptic. I just didn't, I was a kind of a left-brain logical thinker, and people talked about surviving death, and I'm saying, well, this is just a crock, because what could possibly survive? I mean, we are our physical bodies, we are our brains die, we're no more, that's the end of it, get the most out of life and move on. And then, on the morning of September 1st, 2002, my wife, she shot up in bed, she was sitting up and she was trembling, she was visibly shaken and quivering. And I said, what's the matter? And she said, something horrible is going to happen today. And I said, well, what does that mean? Can you tell me more? And she said, I can't tell you exactly, but I just know we're going to be devastated today, So even though I didn't I didn't believe in any of this so-called stuff, I said, or intuition or telepathy or precognition or whatever you want to call it, I took it seriously. And we had 3 children, and I watched over them. One was getting ready to go back to college the next day. My middle daughter was already started her college career, and my youngest one was working one last day in a part-time job. She was 15. And I mean, to make a long story short, at the end of the day, I let my guard down. Her premonition, faded from my awareness. And we were all out together in a restaurant with two cars. My son and my daughter left first to catch up on some packing and schoolwork. And my wife Phran and I followed, and we came across, there's only one road in to where we live, and we came across an accident. My son and my daughter were in a terrible crash, and my daughter didn't survive her injuries, and my son had very significant, brain injuries. And not soon, I guess it was about a month later when it became clear that my son was going to recover from his injuries. It dawned on me, I remembered back to that morning, because I was in shock for a month. And I said, wait a second. I said, how did Phran know? Because she knew. It was obvious that she knew. And then I became obsessed with finding out how she knew, and not only how she knew, but if it was possible that my daughter still existed in some form. And that led me on a journey where I literally crossed the United States, meeting with scientists and medical doctors and researchers that studied consciousness. And I found out that the evidence, although widely unknown, was significant and kind of overwhelming. And one thing led to another. And I've spent the past 20 years learning and educating the public about all of these different, phenomena, one of which you already mentioned, which is mediumship.
So this is one thing that I was fascinated about this. So I don't think I know the answer to this. Was Phran able to have these experiences regularly? Was this just like a one-off out of the blue thing where she was like, something bad's going to happen today? Like, is it something that she'd mentioned before and you kind of brushed it off? Or was this the first and only time and then it happened to come true? Like, what was the thing behind that?
Yeah, that's a reasonable question. The reason that I did take it seriously was that Phran was pretty intuitive, and we had spent, decades together. And in our lives together, there were other times where she mentioned things were going to happen. And they all played out exactly the way she described it, but they were all good things. But, logical thinking told me if she was right then, she could be right now. And that's why I did take it seriously.
Because I know, like, obviously on the Netflix documentary that I mentioned in the intro, Surviving Death, it talks about you really going to a dark place after your daughter's death. Like, it really sort of hit you quite hard. How long did it take you to go through that grieving process initially? Because obviously, I know and this is where we spoke about this off air. It annoyed me in the Netflix documentary that they didn't mention about Phran having this thing at the start, because you mentioned in the documentary that you were blaming yourself. But obviously, people wouldn't have understood why you were blaming yourself. But clearly, hearing that story then, and then you basically said you let your guard down. How was that for you? Because it's like, obviously, there's nothing that you could have done, and I'm assuming that you know that now. But what was that process like for you?
Well, it was torturous. I mean, there was one point to show you how kind of sick I am, is that I literally wrote down on a piece of paper 50 decisions that I could have made that day that would have changed the course of events. I mean, it was, because the guilt is overwhelming, because why did I let them, why did I let my son drive that sports car? Why didn't, I take it more seriously? Why didn't, even to the point where if I would have gotten up from the restaurant 10 seconds early, I could have changed the course of events. So these things are crazy. And, I don't necessarily like or even understand why when people say it's a grief process. I mean, I'm guilty of it myself. I say that, but it's not a linear thing. You read about like the different stages of grief and you go from this to that, but most of that I don't think is true. I think that all of the emotions can hit you all at once and not in any linear fashion. So, in answer to how long, even after I started with the foundation with my wife, Phran, I still wasn't convinced. I mean, I didn't, and I tell people today, although we may help a great number of people today through our information, I didn't, start the foundation to help people. I started it to figure out a way that I was going to survive, because I was in a really bad place. And this, I found it personally helpful in learning. The more I learned, the better that I felt. And it probably took about 7 or 8 years for me to move to the point where I knew this all to be true, that, that we go to a different place based upon the evidence. The evidence became so overwhelming that I relented and I said, okay, I threw myself into it. But yeah, I mean, it's a long, journey when you go through grief, and even knowing about all this stuff. Sometimes even today, my wife passed away in 2020, and then people say to me, well, Bob, I guess with all that and all the talks that you give and all that you've learned and the experiences that you've had, it must be a little bit easier for you than for most people. And that's not really true, because no matter what we're still human. We still have the emotions. I still don't have her in the physical. It's a different kind of relationship and connection. So I think it's helpful if you can come to believe in life after death. And when I say believe, it's really a knowing more than a belief. That will allow you to dig out, when you reach you fall into those deep chasms of despair. You could kind of go through the motions of what you've known and what you've learned, what you've experienced, and you can, resume, your regular life. And when you fall back, you pick yourself up again. So I think that's the difference.
So how do you go from believing to knowing then? Because that's something you said there. It's like, so people believe in this stuff. So most people don't. Most people are very skeptical. Like you said, you're very skeptical. You spent years and years and years convincing yourself into knowing. So let's say for the general population that you sort of work with, I know that most of them, when they come to your foundation, are very open to it. But let's say for the general population, what the stages looking like from going from a non-believer to a believer to knowing? Like, how can people transition, if that makes sense, from these stages?
Yeah, you're right. If I give a talk to members of the foundation, I'm kind of like preaching to the choir, so it's not a good sample. But if I'll give a general talk to the general population, I will generally start off by asking how many people, by a show of hands, believe that there's an afterlife. And I usually get anywhere from 75 to 85% of the people raise their hands. But what I think when I ask if they believe in an afterlife, what they're really saying is that they hope there's an afterlife. And sometimes that's all faith-based, not evidence-based. They're told that there's this other place we go to. They've never seen any direct evidence, so they say that they believe in it. A belief, I think, the hope transitions into belief when they start learning about some of the things that we talk about, or they have some sort of a personal experience, maybe an after-death communication that they can't explain. And eventually, if you're really lucky and you have some really significant experiences, and that could be in the form of a really evidential mediumship session, or a near-death experience, or some profound after-death communication, that belief morphs into something more concrete, which I would classify as a knowing. There's no doubt. The doubt is removed. The fear is removed. And so that's what I think. There's a progression there.
I love that. Like I said, before we go down the rabbit hole of the misconceptions and mediums, and like I said, that's where I really want to sort of go down with this, because as we sort of alluded to, again, a little bit off air, that most people are extremely vulnerable when they go to see mediums, and they're wanting answers. So I really want to make sure that if people are interested in going to see mediums and stuff like that, that they're protected. But before we go down that rabbit hole, can I just ask you, because you mentioned about consciousness, and again, you seeking out about consciousness. So in the position that you are now, after years of doing this, can I just ask you, what is your definition of consciousness? Like, what do you class consciousness as?
After all the research and, over, a couple of hundred years, I mean, the nature of consciousness still remains elusive. There's not one person, scientist, medical doctor, researcher, that can define it. We still, now, most people in the mainstream will tell you that consciousness is absolutely generated by the brain, and electrochemical processes take place and synapses, fire, and that's what produces the experience that we have. Although it doesn't explain the subjective experiences, that we have. I mean, how did these electrical chemical processes result in emotions like love or the appreciation for music, so it's pretty, when we talk about consciousness, sometimes I can use the terms at this to define the same thing: soul, consciousness, or mind. In my view, they're all the same. The key is, can your consciousness act independently of your physical brain? And the evidence that shows that we can. I mean, look at near-death experiences. They meet every definition of death. They have no brain waves, that there's flat, EEGs, and yet they describe these clear and lucid thinking. So other phenomena such as remote viewing or telepathy, where you can pick up information from a distant source. How could you do that if your physical brain is in one part of the world, and you're seeing things or getting information from somebody that's across the globe? So I think that the implication is of a shared consciousness or a shared mind, is that we're all connected in some ways that we can't really understand.
That's one thing that I fully believe in. I think we've done a little bit of a podcast on this before, and this is why I wanted to have you on, because this is something that, again, I'm not an expert in, but all the reading that I'm doing about law of attraction, all this sort of stuff, is very, very clear to me that there is a universal energy. Very, 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 very clear to me. And again, when it comes to vibrational energies and all that sort of stuff, so that's why I wanted to go down this rabbit hole and talk to you about this, because having done some research into, looked at the Netflix documentary, I can see how this all works. But you have to agree on the fundamental principle of this universal energy, which some people don't. But again, if you can agree with that, and again, we did a podcast on it with Marianne, so go and check that out. I fully believe this whole thing of consciousness, and yeah, again, I'm glad you want to clear that thing about consciousness before we move forward. So when it comes to mediums, there is a big misconception about mediums. And you've said before that 85% plus of them can't do what they claim to do. And I think I've heard you say before that you can potentially, on me, do a reading and make it seem like you know about me. Is there any way you could sort of show me a bit about that? Is that something that you could do for me on air?
Well, a lot of mediums that are either fraudulent or maybe just inexperienced, they'll use cold reading techniques. So, let's turn it around. Let's say you're the medium, Daniel, and you're reading me.
Yeah.
So you could say to me things like, do you have a great grandmother in spirit? Well, she'd be 120. So, or you could listen to the way I speak, and if you're good with voices, tell that I'm maybe brought up in New York, because I have a Brooklyn accent, and talk about that. Or you could, so you can make some assumptions by my name about my ethnicity, and you feed off these things. So you can give somebody general information. And I think, as you mentioned at the top of the show, people that are in grief, want to desperately believe, and they'll latch on and make anything fit. And the mediums know that. So they'll repeat, if they get a hit, they'll repeat that same hit maybe 4 or 5 times to give the perception that they are, that they're really giving a lot of evidence. We live in an age. 100 years ago, this wasn't possible, but today, especially with the pandemic, mediums are not doing in-person readings right now. They're doing everything on Zoom. What happens in Zoom? You have the person's full name generally, when they register. So we've caught mediums that they're doing a Zoom reading, and on the left side of their screen, they have the Zoom open, and on the right side of their screen, they have the person's Facebook page open. And they're literally just spitting back all the information that they see on the person's Facebook page. And the sitter, the person getting the reading, is, wow, this medium is unbelievable, but yet it's totally fraudulent. So there's a difference. Mediums are not all the same. There's different, I'll call them skill levels, whatever, but there are different abilities. Some mediums can, the majority, as you mentioned, I said 85 to 90% can't do what they claim. That didn't make me very popular in the mediumship community, but that's based upon my experience. We've been conducting a medium certification evaluation program. A lot of leading scientists that study mediumship helped me devise it. And what I found since 2005 is exactly that. 85 to 90% of the mediums who go through the certification process don't gain certification, which means only 10 to 15% do. So we,
So can you talk about that? Can you talk about that process then? So what's the difference? Again, I've heard you talk about this on another podcast episode. Like, what is this process potentially that these mediums go through? Because I think fundamentally people want to know, how do mediums actually work? Like, so what are you looking out for, and how do they work, and what can they actually do? Because a lot of them claim to do things, but how do they work, and what can they actually do?
Well, mediumship is in essence a telepathic process. I mean, it's mind-to-mind communication, except that one of the parties involved, the person in the spirit realm, doesn't have a body, but they still have a mind. So in that sense, it's still a psychic endeavor, but there's a difference between psychic information and mediumistic information. And even a lot of mediums don't understand this. There are a lot of people that have the great ability to communicate mind to mind with the living. They could look at you and say, Daniel, I see you just painted your bedroom blue, and you did. And you're like, wow, holy shit, right? This is unbelievable. But it doesn't do anything in telling you that we survive our physical deaths. That's just, telepathy. So bearing that in mind, one of the problems that we have is separating the two. So, I mean, I tell our sitters when they're scoring information, unless the information is tied to a discarnate entity, somebody that's deceased, they can't really score it as a hit, But if I'm giving you a lot of information, let's say on your deceased dad, and it's convincing you that I really am communicating, and then I say, oh, by the way, Daniel, your dad is telling me he just liked that you painted your bedroom blue, then I can accept it because you've already laid the groundwork. Also, there's a lot of mediums, and I asked this question on an application. I said, well, what do you think is more important, the evidence or the messages? And surprisingly, a lot of the mediums say it's the messages of love that are important, and they think that if I'm giving you a reading and I say, Daniel, I need to tell you that your father loves you and he's proud of you. And, that's obviously going to be true in most cases, but is that really evidence? But if I first lay the groundwork with all of the evidence, then the messages come, then it becomes significant, and then answer to your question regarding the process, it's long. First of all, no money ever exchanges hands. I mean, in anything that we do, including medium certification. So a medium can't pay us to gain certification. They can't pay us to be listed on the site. The first step is they send us an email expressing their interest. We send them out some pointed questions looking for any possible red flags. If there are none, we invite them to complete an 8-page extensive application. By the way, once we send out that application, 1 out of 10 comes back, because when the medium sees what we're really
hard work,
and then it's not a matter of them sending us a fee and we're giving them a certificate. They don't do it. After the application comes back, it's reviewed by a committee. If the committee thinks that we should go further, an in-depth interview is arranged with the medium, which is about an hour, interview. And if everything comes back, and we think that the medium's the real deal, then we invite them to participate in a session. They do a series of 5 different readings for 5 different sitters who are trained in scoring procedures and how to act during the session. Obviously, as a sitter, you don't want to give the medium any information, but it's important to acknowledge, when the medium is on the right track or when the medium is not, so they know that they have to move on.
Because that's an important thing, isn't it? Because I think a lot of people, as we've alluded to multiple times, a lot of people that go to see mediums are in a very vulnerable position and they are desperate for answers. So they will most of the time give the answers to the medium. They'll start talking, and without realizing it, they will have a fraudulent slip, start saying stuff, forget they've said it, and then the medium just repeats it back to them. And actually, if you look at the session lengths, actually the time the medium was talking versus the time the sitter was talking, it's completely squiffed.
Yeah, exactly. And I understand it because, I was in that position. But so, let's say I desperately want to hear from my daughter and the medium gives me a piece of information that's evidential. I might get so excited. And I said, oh yeah, my daughter was in high school and she wanted to be an English teacher and she loved to play soccer. And like, no, you want the medium to tell you that. You don't want to tell that to the medium. Where I've seen sitters go to readings wearing a locket with a photo of their deceased loved one around their neck. You want to wear the locket, fine, but keep it hidden. You don't want to give cues to the medium. So yeah, that absolutely happens. And on the other hand, I've seen sitters, they just sit there and the medium's giving them correct information and they don't acknowledge it, which is not fair to the medium. So it's important. And also I've seen situations where the medium is going down the track where the sitter doesn't recognize anything. And then it's important to tell the medium, no, my mom is not in spirit, she's here. So the medium knows that they better move on or they're not going to, gain a high score.
I've had it before, like just for my audience to know about this. I've only ever had one experience with this, and it was a card reading. So again, just going to tell a bit of a story. I've never ever spoke about this on the podcast before. There's only a few people in my life that know about this. So I was in Dublin for a course. Something in my life had just happened, and I was quite upset about it. Like a relationship had ended, and I was going to Dublin. And I was walking around Dublin and I had no plan of where I was going to walk. I just knew that I wanted to go to these 2 coffee shops. That's all I wanted to do. I was walking around and it was Christmas time and I decided I was going to go where the Christmas lights took me. So I was going to go, and wherever the Christmas lights took me, I'd go and wander around. And anyway, I came across this store and I thought, oh, this looks really interesting. So I went to walk down this store, in this door, and then these 2 women came up from the basement, like the old London style houses where they had a basement. And I thought, oh, there's like a basement shop. I was like, amazing. So I walked down this basement shop, get to the bottom, and I see this sign for a medium. And I thought, oh, for fuck's sake. Like, genuinely, I was really pissed off. I was like, what is this? And I thought, I can't go back up now. I'm like an idiot. So I walked in, I sit down, and this guy, this really camp guy comes out. And he's like, oh, you're here for a card reading? I was just like, if I have to. He says, oh, that's going to be 75 euros. And I was just like, I was fuming. And he says, oh, do you mind if I have a cup of tea? And I says, yes, but I'm not going to talk to you, because I was fuming. And I was like, I'm not giving you anything. I was like, if you want to have a cup of tea, I'm not telling you anything. So I sat there in silence, had his tea. And he's like, right, I'm going to do this then. So, okay, so he takes me to this room, He starts telling me these really vague things, pops these cards down. He starts telling me these really vague things about my life. They were true, but I was a bit like, because again, I was clearly angry. You could probably tell I was single. So he's like, oh yeah, you've had this relationship breakup, blah, blah, blah. I says, okay. I says, if you're really that good, tell me something about this relationship. There's one key bit of information. I was like, tell me something about this relationship that only you would know if you were doing this thing. He whaps this card down and he went, Easter. And that was such a key thing, this Easter thing. I said, right, you've got me. I said, I can't explain how you know this bit of information, because for Easter, Christmas, I was like, there's no way that you know this. I said, you've got me here. And I says to him, I said, how are you doing this towards the end? Because he allowed me to take notes. He allowed me to do this stuff. I said, how are you doing? He says, I honestly don't know. He says, I'm just here and I just hear these voices and all I'm doing is just passing this information on. He says, I don't know what I'm saying half the time. It just comes through me. So that's my only experience with this, just for my audience. And I've never said that. Sorry to go off on a tangent, but when we're talking about this, I wanted my audience to know that I'm not one way or the other. I believe in life after death. I believe in energy and consciousness and blah, blah, blah. But when it comes to mediumship, I've only ever had that one experience. Yeah.
Well, I don't know necessarily that's, mediumship what you experience, but
what was that? What was that? What was that then? What is that?
That was a piece, that was psychic information. Unless the person would have said to you, I have so-and-so here, that somebody that in spirit, and then said, they're telling me to mention, Easter to you,
Yeah.
Well, then,
yes, I get that. I get it.
Yeah, yes. That would be me mystic. So they may have been pulling out information. One of the arguments against mediumship that the skeptics will say is that mediums are not really communicating with the dead. They're pulling out information from a vast information field. Spiritual people might say it's called the Akashic records. Scientists may call it a 0 point field. But it's the theory that there are these fields of information where everything that ever happened and everything that will happen is stored there. So, I guess that's pretty extraordinary that a medium could, if that were true,
still do it. It's still amazing.
Yeah, that would be even more amazing. I think the community, out of unlimited trillions and trillions of bits of information, you pull out that exact data. But I always think of it. Okay, let's assume they're right. So how does if it's extracting data, how does the medium extract your personality, the loved one's personality? I mean, that's not a piece of data. So I think, and that happens very often in a medium reading. The medium takes on the personality, sometimes even their facial expressions and things that change. So I think it's more reasonable to assume that they are communicating with discarnate entities than simply pulling out, information. And I once took part in a research project where there was a scientist that was studying brain waves of mediums because he wanted to see if there were specific areas in the brain that would show either lighting up or going dark while the medium was engaged in spirit communication. And I got a bunch of mediums together, and he was testing them. But then I mentioned I thought it would be a good idea to see if the brainwave patterns changed while they were engaged in psychic information as opposed to communicating with the dead.
Okay, yeah.
So he agreed, and then when I had to figure out a way to do that. So the way I did it was that there were these things called Zener cards that J.B. Ryan of the Ryan Institute came up with, and it's just a series of they're cards with geometric shapes on it. Like one card might have a triangle, one might have a circle. And there's 5 different cards, and you kind of at random guess what card is coming up next. So you or I would have a 20% chance of guessing with 1 out of 5. So of just spitting out things, we should hit it 20% of the time. And what I found, and believe me, the mediums that were taking part of this were they were all certified by us, and they were extraordinary mediums. They were among the very best. But in terms of card guessing, or psychic information, they were just, none of them really exceeded, only one exceeded that 20% that would be expected. Some were below that. So I concluded from that is that it doesn't necessarily mean that a medium who's very, very gifted in communicating with discarnates is also very gifted in psychic information. So I would caution somebody that if the medium gave you psychic information and told you something about your future, I would caution people about changing their life based upon that prediction. Because besides, we all have free will, and even if there are this tree of life with all these different branches, free will decisions that you make you may not go down the branch that the psychic envisions. So that's just one thing I would add about that.
I'm really glad you pointed that out, because I said obviously I got confused in my head because I knew one of the questions down is about psychics, and I knew the difference between psychic and medium. So when I started talking about the card reading, I'm really glad you corrected me there, because you're completely correct. Obviously, it's a psychic thing, not a mediumship thing. But again, I'm glad we went down that bit of a rabbit hole to differentiate between the two, because again, I think a lot of people get confused between the two, like I just did then. So again, just to clarify, mediums are people that communicate with people who have deceased. Psychics are like basically people that are in this realm, let's call it. Very, very interesting. You mentioned as well about the mediumship. I want to sort of circle back about the evidence-based of stuff. I think there's a lot of really important information there that, again, we keep going back to it, but people that are in a grieving state, it's really easy for a medium to potentially say to people, oh, they're bringing you love, they're safe, they're this. But again, that's all, like, there's no, as you said before, it's really important. There's no evidence to back that up. It's just, if someone's grieving, like, of course, you're telling them what they want to hear. They're not going to want to say, oh, yeah, by the way, your dad thinks you're a dick. Like, that's not going to help them. They want to hear. No, they want to hear, like, oh, by the way, like, again, it's also, like you said, let's say you came to someone for your daughter, all you wanted to hear was, it wasn't your fault. And then straight away, bam, they've got you hooked. And then you create this narrative in your head. And then, so I want to do this, because people can be so extremely vulnerable. How can people protect themselves? Because again, this woman says, so you've got the sitter. So the sitter is the person that's going to see the medium. So my first question is, how can people actually protect themselves when they go and see one? So we've covered a little bit on it about not giving too much information, but is there anything else that people can do to protect themselves so they don't end up down this rabbit hole of essentially being lied to?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing obviously is selecting a medium. So, if we're making the assumption that 85% of them really can't do what they do, that's what they claim, that's a problem. How do you find the 10-15%? We in Forever Family Foundation certify mediums, but obviously we have, since 2005, we only have about 25 mediums that we've certified. So it's not a very big pool. And besides, most of the mediums that we've certified over the years have gone on to be rich and famous and very popular, and they have ridiculously long, waiting lists, and they charge ridiculous amounts of money. So that's one thing that I'm working on, to try to identify new mediums. But after that, I mean, you mentioned you give the medium as little information as possible. The next thing, I mean, which we also mentioned, is you want to, during the reading, you don't want to feed the medium. You don't want to give them more information other than what the medium asked you. It's also important to remain open, because I may want to hear from my deceased daughter, and so I have blinders on, and I'm not acknowledging or recognizing, my grandfather or my dad or my mom or somebody else that's coming through. I mean, if spirit sees a conduit by which they can communicate, they're going to jump into it. So I've seen that people are blinded by their grief, and they're getting incredible evidence, but it's not the person that they were focused on, so they won't acknowledge it or recognize it. I think it's very, very important for you to record the reading, bring a tape recorder with you. If the medium says to you, you can't, I think that's a red flag. A lot of them will say, well, you ask why? Well, because electronics never work, and that's just bullshit. They don't want a record of a bad reading, possibly.
Yeah.
And if a recording, if you don't have a recording device, now you can do it on your phone. Take notes as the reading is going on. And the value of that is, first of all, during the reading, I see time and time again, what the medium says to you is not what you think they said to you. When you play it back, you say, oh my God, I thought the medium said this and it didn't. Or you might see, hear something that the medium said that it didn't register at the time. There's value to that. There's also value to it if you got a really strong reading. When you're feeling bad, and you're getting a bit depressed or missing your loved one, play back that recording. So wait a second, that's definitely, my loved one. So it's a tool for grieving. The same way, with notes. There's another thing that we haven't mentioned. There's a thing called electronic voice phenomena. Mm-hmm. And that is, don't ask me how it happens, but discarnate entities can imprint a voice onto a recording device. It's been studied for 60, 70 years now. And it used to be the reel-to-reel big, actual tapes that were running. Now it's any digital device. And you simply set out your intention to your deceased loved one, and you turn on the recorder for maybe 20 or 30 seconds. You'll never hear it live while it's being recorded. I don't know why that is, but on playback, sometimes you'll hear a voice. And I don't want to give the impression it's going to happen every time. Sometimes people experiment with it for a year and it doesn't happen, or then it starts happening. And also it appears that some people are better at capturing these things than others. I'll give you an example. There's a medium that's certified by our foundation. Her name is Janet Mayer, and unrelated to mediumship, she's been experimenting with electronic voice phenomena for like 10 years. And she was friendly with my wife, Phran. And after Phran passed, she asked me if it would be okay if every week she would make up 7 questions to ask my wife, Phran in spirit. And then she'd turn on the recorder and she would send me the audio files. One time she said, Phran, what is the name of the organization that you founded? And you hear faintly but clearly, Forever Family Foundation. That's pretty incredible. Another day, it was last year, this month, and she said, Phran, you have a message for Bob. It happened to be my birthday on that day. And you hear on the recording, happy birthday. So, that's something, electronic voice phenomena is fantastic in the respect that it's physical evidence. It's something that I could hear with my own physical ears. It's like,
and you can. They talk about it in the Netflix documentary as well, isn't there? There's a lady there. I'm not sure it's the lady you're talking about, but it talks about it there. And it's really interesting because you're sort of seeing it. And I think it's one of the biggest things with this. Like, there's a lot of people that can listen to this podcast and they're going to be thinking, I don't believe in any of this stuff. And again, it's one of the things where I think until you, as you said before, you go through the stages of the just being open to it, open to the possibility of it, and then trying some of the stuff out, that you'll then go about hearing it. Because again, in this Netflix documentary, again, I'm very aware that Netflix documentaries, that they can change things to do whatever they wanted to do. But it's just very bizarre to me how some of this stuff, as you said, like there's actual scientific evidence to back this up. Like, and that's the thing that for me, I find that's the bizarre thing. When you tell that, people's like, well, what do you mean by that? So can you talk to me about some of this actual scientific stuff that backs this up? Because I don't think people will believe that there is scientific evidence for it.
Yeah, well, most people, and a lot of people, and a lot of scientists and medical doctors refuse to acknowledge the evidence, even when you bring it up to them. But I mean, the areas of research from near-death experiences have been studied now for decades. You know, as we're able to resuscitate more people that die, especially in a hospital setting, and when they come back, they describe certain things that should be impossible. I mean, they meet every definition of death. They have no brain waves, they have no respiration, they have no heartbeat, they have no reflexes. For all intents and purposes, you know, they're dead. That's what medical science, how they define death. And yet they describe these incredible things. I mean, not every near-death experiences the same thing, but there are certain commonalities, like moving through a dark place like a tunnel and going to a light, being met by deceased loved ones and having conversations with them, being above their body, and seeing from a different vantage point, let's say, on the ceiling, and seeing and hearing everything that's going on, having clear and lucid thinking, which they have knowledge that they didn't have before. It's like unlimited knowledge. They describe the setting, of being, where they could taste colors, like synesthesia, all the senses, were intensified and happening all at once. So all of these things, and it's something that the scientists have been studying for quite some time. The evidence is overwhelming, and it's really one of the best forms of evidence that we have, that we're more than our physical bodies. There are these end-of-life experiences or deathbed visions. I've experienced that with my own family, several times, that people that are in that window, either just before death or in 1 or 2 weeks before, start having conversations with other people, and that are in the room, that most of the time the people that are in, the visitors can't see them, but they do, and they reach out to them, and they're smiling, and despite being in being physically incapacitated or mentally impaired, they still have these experiences, and the implication is that we all have some assistance, when we cross over. I mean, I'll tell you a quick story that's somewhat humorous. When my mother was near death, we were sitting she was in home hospice, and she was sitting in a recliner chair in the living room, and we had a semicircle of chairs facing her. But the chair directly in front of her was empty, and then all of a sudden my mother, even though she was, semi-coherent, all of a sudden she would reach out directly in front of her to the chair and start talking to her mother, and smiling, and you could just see that glow in her, mom, mom. And then my father happened to walk into the room. He was in a different room. He was in the kitchen, and he saw that empty chair, and he sat down in that chair. And my mother went ballistic. Get up, get up. My poor father didn't realize that he sat on his mother-in-law, and he was bewildered, and I've experienced it with my wife and talking to her mom and aunt and so forth. So these are things that, have been studied. I mean, reincarnation. Incidentally, you'll see a lot of these things covered in the Netflix documentary. And the first episode, I think, was on NDEs, and the last one was on reincarnation. Scientists have been studying past life memories of children for the last 50 years with, thousands upon thousands of cases, and that evidence is very compelling. So there are a lot of things. It's easy to dismiss any one of these things, such as mediumship or near-death experiences, and you can make all these arguments, although I can refute, most of them. But when you step back and you examine all of it, and you take it as a whole, the thing that makes the most sense is that, we're more than our physical bodies, and we survive our physical death. And, there's some value in all this. People say, well, why should I even care? I mean, and I was thinking about this morning, is that this week I'm reaching another one of those milestone birthdays. And as I reflect back on my life, I remember that these, birthdays with a zero attached to them, I always used to get depressed. I always used to have a bad feeling from them. I didn't enjoy them at all. And the reason for that is that I had a great fear of my own mortality. The thought of being extinguished forever was extremely frightening to me, inconceivable. And now, as I reach another one of these things, I have absolutely zero fear. As a matter of fact, like, I embrace it. And the value, I think, for all of us is, if we believe that we survive our physical deaths and we're more than our physical bodies, and we can remove that fear and all these phobias that we have, we could live our lives, our physical lives, with more meaning and purpose, because the fear is gone, and we just take it as it comes and enjoy. So I think there's a value to all this, from an emotional and health perspective.
I could be, so the book that changed it all for me was a book by Thich Nhat Hanh, the monk, called Fear. Basically, his whole thing is that if you agree with science, that energy cannot be destroyed, and if you also agree with science that we are more energy than anything else, then what happens to us after we die? Like, we cannot die. The energy has to go somewhere. So again, if you then believe in this eternal energy, which again I do, this whole thing that goes around us, like this energetic field, like, so then you've got to go back to something. So that's my whole thing. And ever since I read that, I was like, oh yeah, energy can't be destroyed. We are more energy than anything else. Like, so we just literally transfer the energy onto something else. So I think it's a fascinating concept of it. Again, I spoke to you before we started about this, but could I just ask you, since your wife's passing, how have you handled this compared to your daughter? Because obviously you're a lot further along your journey now. You've experienced all this stuff with mediumship and the acceptance of life after death. How have you handled it? Obviously, I know grief is still grief. You spoke about this, and I'm not saying for a single second it's been a joyous thing. I'm not saying that for a second, but how have you dealt with it differently compared to your daughter?
You know what? When you lose somebody, close to you like that, it sucks no matter what you believe in, and with all I know, and, so even with my wife's passing, I mean, we were one and the same, 46 years together. It's still hard, it's very hard, it's people say, and it's kind of silly when they ask the comparison between the two. I mean, I just wanted to die when my daughter, died. Now I don't have the same, wish, but it's just the memories are that much stronger, and it's a challenge every day. But I'm better able to keep going. I don't wish that I was dead like I did after my daughter, because I have this knowledge that not only does she survive in some form, but that the likelihood is that I'm going to see her again. This is just if I think of physical existence as a little blip in a continuum of life. I mean, there's a lot of people say that this is really the dream world. Where we're going is the real. And then a lot of people say that we can't really get, because I always question. I said, look, if there are these other realms and we continue to evolve and become more enlightened and grow, what the hell do we need the physical world for? Why can't we just do all the growth on the other side? And the explanation I usually hear is that this physical slice of life is the most beneficial in learning, that we can't get the same learning experiences as we can, when we reach beyond the physical. I don't know whether that's true or not, but the other thing that I never could reconcile in my mind is that if reincarnation is real, why the hell would somebody choose to come back to this physical life and live a life of poverty or hunger or sickness or bullying or rejection? And you can't explain it in physical terms. But if you believe that we're all fragments of a greater oversoul, let's call it, and we're all part of that one conglomerate, then maybe we recognize that with that perspective, that this is one piece of the puzzle that we need to experience. I'll accept that, because otherwise nothing makes sense to me.
I really like how you said that. It's that's something for me. I think I said this to you before. I think it was off air about the grief thing. Like that's something I would want to go back and listen and sort of take from that, because hearing you talk about it, it's like I said, it's never going to be an easy thing. But I think a lot of people, when they're going through grief, like they it paralyzes them so much where they don't want to carry on, as you said. But since this obviously takes time to go through, it's like, no, just keep going, So on that note, with this, what bit of advice would you give to somebody that is actually struggling with grief right now, that does feel lost, that does feel stuck, that maybe doesn't know where to turn? Do you have a bit of advice that you would give to anyone that's in that situation?
Well, the first thing is, I mean, there is a such thing as bibliotherapy. I mean, I used to feel better while I was reading about this stuff, you know, because it gave me some hope, you know. So I would encourage people, and we have lists of recommended books on our website of, you know, on foreverfamilyfoundation.org, and by category, you know, pick one out and just keep reading. I mean, I literally, if you walked in my house today, you'd see 1,500 books on the afterlife. It's insane, but I just kept reading and reading and reading. The other thing is, it's been proven in clinical studies published in peer-reviewed journals that those who believe in an afterlife do better in their grief than those that don't. And that makes sense to me. I mean, what could give you more hope than the belief that your loved one still exists and you'll see them again? So that makes perfect sense. We always stress that it shouldn't just be blind faith. I mean, you should seek out the evidence for that, or try to foster some personal experience. So I think learning, there's a thing, cognitive behavior therapy. We can change the way we think. So we can change the way we think about death. So if you could reach that point, you will do better. And that there's only two ways to get there. One from learning, about the evidence, and the other is from having a profound experience, and that's the way you can get there. But if you think of it like coping mechanisms, I used to use, I don't know how, if people can relate to it, but I used to think that, we're all on this train ride and we're all going to die. It wasn't that I'm never going to die, even if my daughter, we're all done. It's just a matter of time. So some of us get off at the first stop and some of us get off, at a later stop, but we all get off, and so that in some weird way, I found comforting, that it wasn't something that only happened to her. It's going to happen to me and everybody else that ever existed and ever will. That's just the way it is. So, we all find our ways in grief. Grief is it's different. I mean, lots of times, even within the same family, partners grieve, totally different. There's no right or wrong way. And people don't know how to, they don't know what to say among people in grief, very often. And they'll say some things that seem like pretty stupid, but I remember after my daughter died, I had a friend of mine come over and she just looked at me and she saw the shape I was in. She said, "I don't know how you do it. If it was me, I would have killed myself." So now I'm supposed to feel guilty about not killing myself. I don't have enough shit to deal with. So it's like, she meant well, she was trying to express her feelings, but you have to, the best thing you could do when somebody's in grief, honestly, give them a hug. I mean, maybe we shouldn't be, now it's different in the pandemic age, but that's the only thing that's meaningful. I get it. I'm sorry. Here's a hug. Yeah. Virtually not much else that you're going to say is going to be of much value. No, yeah, and again, probably not in the headspace to hear it anyway. Even if you came up with the most profound answer, they're not going to be in the headspace to hear it anyway. Honestly, Bob, this has been an incredible conversation. I've really thoroughly enjoyed this. Like I said, we've gone down some rabbit holes I wanted to go down. And again, I just wanted to say thank you again for being so open and honest about just sharing some of your personal stuff as well. Again, I really appreciate that. And I know my audience will as well. Where can people find out more information about you? Because you do have a book as well. So where can people find out about your book, and where can people find out more about your foundation? All right. Well, the foundation is, spelled out, foreverfamilyfoundation.org. It has a wealth of information about all the things we've been talking about. And we also have a radio show that we've been airing every Thursday since 2005. So maybe you read a book and you want to learn more about that person. The chances are we've interviewed them over the years, so you could go into the archives and play it back. We hold grief retreats like the one depicted in the Netflix series. I write a blog on beyondthefivesenses.com, and the book is called The Medium Explosion, and that's available, on Amazon and wherever. So Anybody needs to communicate with me, my email is robert@foreverfamilyfoundation.org.
Honestly, this has been an absolute pleasure. And I'll say thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you. It was my pleasure, Daniel.